So does anybody remember the overall outline that I gave you for the first 5 books, for the Pentateuch?
I don't remember, but I can read it.
Okay. Or just how we summarize those first 5 books. You have creation and fall in Genesis. What happens in Exodus? What's the focal point in Exodus? I'm sorry? Redemption. Okay, as Exodus, Passover. Passover is going to be huge for the rest of the Old Testament. God keeps going back there. He keeps pointing them back. And it's really half of the Old Testament prophets' ministry. The Old Testament prophets take past redemption and future hope and apply that into present realities for God's people. So that past redemption, how God has redeemed them as his own people, that is rooted in the Exodus story, is huge. It overshadows the rest of the Old Testament. All right? And, okay, that's Genesis, Exodus. Then we come to Leviticus. What's Leviticus about? Overarching. Worship. So we have the sacrifice, we have the festivals, we have the priesthood and the requirements of the priesthood, we have the purity laws, and then in the very center that those frame, what's that centerpiece in chapter 16 of Leviticus? The Day of Atonement, the highest holy day in Israel, the quietest day in all of Israel. In fact, from the first day of that month to the 10th day, those are called the 10 days of awe. From the trumpets sounding to gather the nation and remind them that atonement is coming, and after that the Feast of Tabernacles on the 15th. Those first 10 days are days of awe, days of reflection. And the Day of Atonement itself on the 10th day is a high holy day in Israel. Everything stops. Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement. That's why you had one of Israel's wars, I think it was in 73, it was called the Yom Kippur War because the Arabs attacked on the Day of Atonement, the day that Israel would be least ready to mount a rapid response because of the practice of that day. Okay, worship in Leviticus, and then Numbers. Faith. Okay, fallen humanity is redeemed to worship by faith. We live faith, and where does that faith play out? What is the context? Where does the events of the book of Numbers happen? In the wilderness, on the way out of Egypt, but not in the land. They head out from Sinai. They're on the way, but we're not home yet. There's some parallels that we could draw out of that, certainly. And then you get to the book of Deuteronomy, and what's Deuteronomy emphasizing? Covenant. So there's a neat setup there together. Fallen humanity redeemed for worship by faith in covenant relationship with God. So that's how I like to keep track of the Pentateuch, those first 5 books myself, kind of make sense of it, keep it together. All right, in the book of Numbers, we've got a smaller group tonight, so this would be a great time as well to have any discussion, any back and forth things that you've been wondering about. We can certainly take a little time to get to that. Any overall comments first about the reading background that you got out of the book of Numbers? Anything stand out, or as you were perusing through, anything in particular that caught your attention? One of those I always wondered about.
The one thing that I think about with Numbers is just like in today's world, if we had to wait 40 years to do something, it just seems so undoable.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
So how people kept the faith that long is
Yeah.
amazed, to be honest.
Yeah, a whole generation waits, knowing that they're not going to enter in. Yeah. You also wonder the dynamics. There's tension. Typically, there's some tension between generations. And that's true across societies. It plays out differently in one society over another. But there's some tensions when a new generation is coming into their own. And Wonder if there's any resentment along the way. We're still out here because of you guys. I don't know. The book of Numbers is named, well, we get the book of Numbers for what? Where's that come from? Where do we get that in the Christian Bible?
Counted on.
Okay, the numbering of the people at the opening of the book and then again at the closing of the book. Well, wait a minute, David did that and he got in trouble. Well, we haven't got there yet. But David did that and he got in big trouble for that. But here God tells them to number the people. And it's interesting, the numbers at the end that enter the land are really, really close to the numbers that left Sinai and could have entered the land. It's quite close. It's just the next generation. So you have the big story. You have in Numbers. The people leave Sinai. They are ready. They've been about a year now, I think, total. And they get to Kadesh Barnea and they are ready. They send spies into the land. God tells them to send spies into the land. They send spies into the land to check it out, to see that it's everything that God told them. And the spies bring back a report. But what is that report?
We can do this.
Yeah, we can't do it. Well, what's wrong with that?
No faith in God.
Yeah, God never told them they could do it. That's not the point. They've got their eyes in the wrong place now. And actually, to tie that into this morning, now it's about what are we going to do instead of what will God do for us. And we can't do this. The land is just as good as God said. And they traveled. They come into the land and they take what's called the rich route. They traveled the Patriarchal Highway, which is interesting because it's the same path that Abraham would have took in Genesis. When Abraham comes in Genesis and he comes south through the land and he hits one place after another, he's traveling this high route, this ridge route. He doesn't go the coast highway. He doesn't go east of the Jordan on the King's Highway. Instead, he's going across the middle, which is called in some schools now the Patriarchal Highway, because that was the route that Abraham, also Jacob, in and out of the land traveled. And so the spies take that same trek. They go up through Hebron, where Abraham had lived, where his tomb was, and they go further up. They go all the way up into Galilee. They go past Galilee up into the north, and it's a beautiful land. It's a wonderful land. They bring back these huge grapes from the harvest, because it's the time of grape harvest, and everything looks good, except the people are too big.
You're too tall.
Too tall. They're all giants. They're all giants, which again was an exaggeration. We can make things seem bigger in our own minds as they do. And so they decide they're not going to go in. There's a failure to launch. We're going to live at home in Mom's basement. And then they wander in the wilderness. And then again we get to the end of the book, and what are we doing again? Preparing to enter. So you have preparing to enter the first 10 chapters, failure to enter the next 10 chapters, wandering in the wilderness, and then again preparing to enter the final 11 chapters. That's how I outlined it. So let's dip in there a little bit and talk about those things. The preparing to enter, first of all. As they're preparing to enter, what's going on? What stands out to you there? There is the numbering in chapter 4. Take a census. Well, actually, it happens before chapter 4, doesn't it? That's the census of the Levites. The census is in chapter 1, and then the positioning of the people, and then they count the Levites as well. The description of a Nazirite vow, which is again setting apart the people. And there's just everything. It's kind of just nuts and bolts. We're getting everybody lined up, and we know who's who and who's here and who's coming, and off they go. And then in chapter 11, while they're going along, they set out, it's chapter 10, verse 33, they set out from the mount of the Lord 3 days' journey. They've been on the road 3 days. The ark of the covenant of the Lord went before them. And the cloud of the Lord was over them by day whenever they set out from camp. And whenever the ark set out, Moses said, "Arise, O Lord, and let your enemies be scattered, and let those who hate you flee before you." And when it rested, he said, "Return, O Lord, to the 10,000 thousands of Israel." And then we get to chapter 11. And the murmurings begin. The failure to enter is actually going to arise a little later in chapter 13 and 14. But we lay the ground for it already in chapter 11. Look at verse 4. What do you see? There's a rabble that was among them, the mixed multitude that came with them out of Egypt, and the people of Israel also wept again and said, "Oh, that we had meat to eat." Remember back in Egypt? Remember back when we were slaves and we were so miserable and we were being whipped and beaten and to make bricks without straw? No, it's remember when we were in Egypt and we had meat, we had fish that cost us nothing. They gave us, it was like all you can eat catfish night out the Nile, and with vegetables and relish, cucumbers and melons. Man, it was great. Remember those days? Remember how it used to be? And now here we are. And there's nothing at all to eat but this, what is it? This manna. I mean, we have got banana bread, manna muffins. We have got manna pancakes. We have got manna porridge. On it goes. Everything. I think I said banana bread. I meant banana bread. It's the Keith Green line.
Probably saying, where's the beef?
Yeah, that's what well, they're saying, where's the fish? But it's the same point, isn't it? And well, Moses was displeased. And Moses says to the Lord, "Why have you dealt ill with your servant?" Has God dealt poorly with Moses? No, Moses says, this whole leadership thing would be great if it wasn't for the people. Yeah, teaching, it would be great if it wasn't for the students. We used to say when I was teaching electronics, one area or another that can be applied. But why have I not found favor in your sight that you lay burden of all this people upon me? Did I conceive them? Did I give them birth that you should say to me, carry them? Where am I to get meat for all these people? There's a tension there that Moses could easily take upon himself. Trouble that is not his. I love Hezekiah's response in Isaiah 36, 37, when the Assyrians are surrounding, and he takes the letter he gets from the Assyrian, he takes it into the temple, he lays it out before the Lord. Lord, you've got mail. I can't do anything with this, but they're talking about you here. And God handles it. God deals with it. And that's really Moses' best response here. But what ends up happening in that chapter? Do you remember? You want meat? I'm going to give you meat. He gave them, there's a line in the Psalms that says he gave them the desire of their heart, but he sent leanness unto their souls. He sent, another version reads, a wasting disease among them. But I like the one translation, the way I remembered it. He gave them the desires of their heart, but he sent leanness into their soul. That gets my attention. That worries me. I don't want leanness of soul. I don't want weakness or affliction of spirit. He says, I will give you meat, down in about verse 19. You shall eat it not just 1 day or 2 days or 5 or 10 or 20, but a whole month until it comes out of your nostrils. Now this is a fun figure of speech, a Hebrew idiom. What is he saying? How is the meat that they eat going to come out of their nostrils? When you're puking your guts out, yeah. You are going to be so sick of it. That's very graphic, isn't it? Yes, but I'm sure you've had the flu to some extent at some time where it was that bad. And it's horrible. And he says, I'll give you meat then. And so he does. And there's these quail that come upon the camp, and they fly, and they just drop out of the sky, and the camp is inundated with meat. They have all the meat they need to eat, and yet the Lord struck the people with a plague. Psalm 78, if you want that quote on, he gave them the desires of their heart, that's Psalm 78. I had that just written in my own marginal note there. So you have the grumbling against God's provision in chapter 11, and then grumbling comes up again. This time it's Miriam and Aaron against Moses and Moses' bride in chapter 12. There's another setback. And now we get, well, you have another grumbling in chapter 16. Before we go that far, it's a similar grumbling where you have Korah, the son of Izhar, son of Kohath, the son of Levi. He's in the priestly tribe, at least, although he's not in the division that was descended from Aaron that is given the priesthood. These are Levites that are given other responsibilities. And there are some others who were sons of Reuben. They're not in the tribe of Levi at all. I'm in chapter 16, verse 1. And they rose up before Moses with a number of the people of Israel, 250 chiefs of the congregation, well-known men. They assembled themselves against Moses and Aaron and said, "You've gone too far, for all in the congregation are holy, every one of them. Why do you exalt yourselves above the people as a whole?" This is one of those people popular movements, right? A democratic movement, and yet contrary to the will of God. God has said, this is how it is. I will set my priests. He's going to echo that later. I will set my king on my holy hill of Zion. God will determine who it is that's going to be a priest. And he gives each one their place. And there's a need for contentment. And that's what the people are wrestling with here. So there's a broader thing going on about contentment here that you see popping up over and over again. The question of the priesthood is, well, it's answered when the ground opens up and swallows them up. But it's answered further in chapter 17. Here's the story of Aaron's rod that budded. And this is going to be important. You have basically Aaron has a staff like Moses have a staff, like maybe they all have walking sticks as they're walking through the wilderness. It's just a stick. Well, apparently it's an almond wood stick. But what Moses says to do, what God tells Moses to do, he said, okay, speak to the people of Israel, chapter 17, verse 2. Get from them staffs, one for each of the father's house, from all their chiefs, according to their father's house, 12 staffs, one from each tribe or clan or family group. Every staff is there. Write each one's name on his staff. Write Aaron's name on the staff of Levi. So for the tribe of Levi, to show that God has made a distinction one to another. And there'll be one staff for each of the houses. Then you'll deposit them in the tent of meeting before the ark of the testimony, where I meet with you. And the staff of the man whom I choose shall sprout. Thus you will cease from me the grumblings of the people that they grumbled against you. I'm going to validate my choice as to which of the families the priesthood will come through. All the chiefs gave their staffs. They all lay them before the Lord. They're going to see which straw God draws, right? That's kind of what's going on. Well, the next day Moses went into the tent of the testimony, went into the tabernacle, and behold, the staff of Aaron for the house of Levi had sprouted. Not only that, but it put forth buds. And not only that, but it produced blossoms. And not only that, but it bore ripe almonds all in one night. Now, that then fulfills the question. It's the only staff that does this, so clearly the priesthood resides with Aaron. Okay, question solved. God drew a straw, he picked which one, and it's just as he said it was going to be. But there's something else there that's even bigger. Something that we get just a hint at here, but it's going to be huge later on in the story. This was just a stick. It was just a lifeless stick. It wasn't even stuck in a jug of water overnight. And yet, you have poinsettia flowers here, right? Well, when I lived in southern Africa, we had poinsettia trees. They would grow big, and they would shoot up 10 feet in one growing season. In fact, you could take one of those long stalks out of the poinsettia tree, and you could cut it into 18-inch pieces, and you could stick that in dirt and water it well, and it would grow a new bush. Crazy. You could put it in the dirt, but it didn't happen overnight. And it didn't happen just by laying it in the tent. This was just a stick. These were walking staffs. This was dead wood. And out of that which was dead comes new life and fruit. That's what's going on here. The badge of the priesthood is not just God picks one staff over the others. The badge of the priesthood is life out of death. And we're going to see that later in the story. In a tomb outside Jerusalem. But let's circle back around to the sending of the spies. The spies go in and the spies come out, and the spies and Israel grumble all about. It's a good land, it's a wonderful land, but we can't do it. And so all of the congregation in chapter 14 raises the loud cry. The people wept that night, and all the people grumbled against Moses and Aaron. Would that we had died in Egypt. Why is the Lord bringing us into this land to fall by the sword? Yep, 40 years is a long time. How about a few months is a long time when you don't see what you're looking for? And Moses and Aaron fell down, and they try to convince the people, and they're praying. Joshua and Caleb run out there and say, the land we passed through to spy is exceedingly good. If the Lord delights in us, he will bring us into that land. He will give it to us, a land that flows with milk and honey. Only do not rebel against the Lord. That's not just what's happening in the book of Numbers. That's going to be the basis of the covenant. If we remain faithful to the Lord and we will trust him, he will do for us what he says he will do. He will give us the victory. We will enjoy his blessing in the land that he will give us. If we don't trust him, if we do not believe him, nor follow him or walk in his ways, we are not going to experience the blessings of it. And so what will be Israel's experience in the future, this generation that leaves Egypt is the first to experience the reality of it. Because they do not believe. In verse 11, the Lord says to Moses, how long will this people despise me? Look down on me. Think little of me. That's a strong statement. But to some extent, that's what it is to not believe God's promise, to look down on him, to think little of him. In spite of all the signs that I have done, I will strike them with pestilence and disinherit them. And based on Moses, I'm ready to start over with you. And Moses again says, Lord, the Egyptians will hear about it. They'll think that because you were not able to bring them in, that you killed them out here in the wilderness. Don't do that. He pleads for God's name, for God's reputation. There's an echo in chapter 14, verse 16, of Exodus 34, 6 and 7 also. Do you remember when the Lord passes by and he announces himself? The Lord is slow to anger and abounding in steadfast love, verse 18. Forgiving iniquity and transgression, but he will by no means clear the guilty, visiting the iniquity of the fathers and the children to the third and fourth generation. Please pardon the iniquity of this people, according to the greatness of your steadfast love, as you have forgiven this people from Egypt until now. Does God pardon them? Does God forgive them? How do you know? It says so in verse 20. Yeah, it wasn't a trick question. And God pardoned them. The Lord said, I have pardoned them. Yet, does that mean, okay, pardoned, they are forgiven, off into the land we go? No. There is forgiveness, and yet there will still be or can still be consequences. I know what it is to be forgiven and yet still feel the consequences. There might be limitations. There might be restitution. There's consequences to our actions sometimes. There's a loss of privilege. There's a loss of entrance with somebody. An opportunity of ministry that we won't have because of our sin, because of our failure. And yet those consequences are not to be confused with God's forgiveness. I think that's an important point that we can draw out of this. They will wander in the wilderness, but the wilderness is the place where they will learn to believe God and to trust him. What's the definition of faith in Hebrews chapter 11? Faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen, or some versions not yet seen. Yeah, faith is that which we haven't seen by sight yet. Otherwise, it wouldn't be faith. Faith is believing what God has promised that we have not yet seen. And so faith is exercised. That's why I write faith over the book of Numbers, even with the failures in the midst. They're not always a people of faith here, but the wilderness is where faith is learned. When we don't yet see, we don't yet experience what has been promised, but wait for it and walk toward it, even if it's a long walk. So there's the failure to enter. Anything else in that section that caught your eye? Let me carry on from chapter 21. In the wilderness, then the wandering, you could consider it, the next 5 chapters. There's some interesting things that are going on there. There's the bronze serpent, which is huge. Does anybody recall where the bronze serpent pops up in the New Testament?
The serpent was lifted up in the wilderness, so must the Son of Man be lifted up.
Yeah, that whoever believes on him. Jesus, in his conversation with Nicodemus, he goes all the way back to that serpent in the wilderness. The one other place I'm aware, it's coming to mind right now that it comes up in the Old Testament, is Hezekiah breaks up the bronze serpent. Apparently, the bronze serpent was saved. Look what God did, and they kept it to remember, and it became an idol. And so Hezekiah destroys it because it has become an idol that Israel worships. So that which was a remembrance of how God had spared them actually became an idol later on in their experience. So the bronze serpent, they are grumbling again, and so serpents are sent among them and bite them, and they're dying. And Moses makes a serpent out of bronze, and whoever looks to the serpent, it's a silly thing. How's that going to help anybody? But that's kind of what it is to believe in Jesus. That's just silly. That doesn't change me. It doesn't fix me. It doesn't change anything about my circumstances. What difference is that going to make? It's believing God. God said, look at the serpent and you will live. And that the symbol of the consequence of their sin is lifted up on a pole, even as the consequence, the guilt of our sin, and thus the payment for it was lifted up on a pole in Christ. And there you see the picture fulfilled. And whoever looked upon the serpent lived. And there's a song out of that. Out of God's deliverance, there's songs. Spring up, O well, the well that the princes made, the nobles of the people dug with the scepter in their staffs. They now have water again, and everything's wonderful. And we go on to, well, you have some victories here with Moab and Ammon, and as they go from one place to another, they're marching through. But they run into, so they pass Esau, and Esau is not helpful, but they go around Esau because Esau's family. How's Esau family? He's the brother of Jacob, or the half-brother of Jacob? No, twin brother. He's twin brother of Jacob. Yeah, I'm getting Isaac and Ishmael mixed up. Yes, twin brother. Yeah, they're close. They're family. And yet God chose Jacob, through which the line, the blessing, the seed, the Messiah was going to come through. But Esau's family, we're not going to go attack Esau, and Esau's not cooperated. We'll just go around. They come to Moab. What do they do with Moab? Don't take Moab stuff. Ease on around. Go through peaceably. They come even to, who is it? Ammon. Ammon. Now, where do Moab and Ammon come from? Anybody remember? Moab and Ammon. Not from Ishmael, but from Lot. These are the two peoples that come from Lot's daughters decide all of humanity has been destroyed except for us. We need to have relations with our Father in order to preserve the human race. Desperate moves to preserve the human race. And we get Moab and Ammon out of that. So they are related. They're family. I'm sorry, what? No, yeah, they're not the family you always talk about, but they're family. And the relations will be strained. However, there is this Moabitess Ruth who will enter the story later. So they pass around Moab and Ammon. They battle with Amorites, however. And the difference between Ammon's land And the Amorites' land is going to come to play later on in the book of Judges. One of the judges, I think it's Jephthah, is going to have this argument with the Amorites because the Amorites are saying, you took our land. He's going to say, no. We have not taken any more land than God gave us when we entered, which your God did not give to you. And so let you enjoy what your God gives to do, and you and Israel will enjoy what our God has given to us. That's how Jephthah the judge answers that. They end up going to war, and Jephthah wins, and the Amorites lose. But that's a story in the book of Judges. So we come to the Balak and Balaam. This is an odd story. What's going on with Balak and Balaam?
Wants to conquer Israel.
Okay. Israel comes along and they're a huge threat. There's this mass of people sitting on his doorstep. And he's the king of Moab. Is he under threat? Not according to God's word, he's not. They're just going to ease right on by. But this is a whole new big people in his territory. And that makes him nervous. Okay? So what's he do about it? What's his plan? Attack them outright? There's too many of them. So what's his plan?
Balak is like a prophet.
Okay, Balaam the Seer.
Balaam the Seer.
Balaam, like a prophet, yes. He's known to hear from the Lord and to speak for the Lord. And so he hires him.
Hires him to curse Israel.
Yeah, he says, come over here and help me. I got somebody I need to hire you to give a curse. And, Balaam likes the idea, but God says no, and God says don't go. So he's got, regrettably, he sends a nice letter, regrettably, I'm not able to make that commitment at this time for a variety of reasons. Wish I could, but I can't, so I shan't. And so Balak, not to be turned down, sends another offer with a little more persuasive, makes him an offer he can't refuse. And so he really wants to go, and so the Lord says, okay, you really want to go, huh? Who are these people you're still having conversation with? You really want to go, do you? Okay. So he goes, but the Lord is angry with Balaam. He wants to go. The Lord says, well, okay, go ahead, we'll go, but that's not God's will. And he's about to be struck down along the way by an angel of the Lord in his path. And who is it that rescues him? A donkey. Isn't it amazing that the donkey can see what the seer cannot when it comes to the things of the Lord? Wow, I hope I don't get in that condition. So the donkey can see. The donkey finally opens up his mouth, and Balaam the seer is rebuked by the donkey. Lord opened the mouth of the donkey, and she said to Balaam, in verse 28 of chapter 22, what have I done to you that you have struck me these 3 times? And Balaam said to the donkey, because you have made a fool of me. I wish I had a sword in my hand that I would kill you. And the donkey said to Balaam, am I not your donkey, which you've ridden all your life? Come on, think about it, dude. Have I ever done anything like this to you before? And Balaam ought to be thinking, wait a minute, has my donkey ever talked before? The whole story is kind of fantastical, but out of it, Balaam repents of his evil, and the Lord tells him to go anyway. Because God still has a plan he's going to do. God seems to take the things that the enemy would do to destroy us, and God turns it and uses it for good. And so Balaam goes, and he took up this discourse. He's taken by Balak to the people of Israel. Here, there they are. See them out there? What a mess they are. You've got to curse them for me. And he says, how can I curse whom God has not cursed? How can I denounce whom the Lord has not denounced? From the top of the crags I see him, from the hills I behold him, a people dwelling alone, not counting itself among the nations. Who can count the dust of Jacob, or number the 4th part of Israel? Let me die the death of the upright, and let my end be like his. Let me be upright like him. Let me be multiplied, unnumberable, as God will make Jacob. It's not an out-and-out blessing, plain as day, but that's what it means. So he tries to hide the blessing, because he doesn't want Balak mad at him. He still wants to be paid. But Balak is not pleased. What have you done? I took you to curse them, and you've done nothing but bless them. Balak realizes what he's said here. He's described Israel's increase, not their demise. He takes them to another place, and Balaam starts again. Rise, Balak, and hear. Give ear to me, O son of Zippor. God is not man that he should lie, or a son of man that he would change his mind. Has he not said, will he not do it? Or has he spoken, and will he not fulfill it? If only Israel could hear these words. These are not just about Balaam and Balak here. And so it goes on, the Lord their God is with them, verse 21. The shout of a king is among them. God brings them out of Egypt. There's no enchantment, there's no curse against Jacob, no divination against Israel. Now it shall be said of Jacob and Israel, what God has wrought. Look what God has done. That's what will be said of them. Again, is this a curse? This is a blessing. This is good news. And Balak is furious. Don't curse them anymore. Don't bless them anymore. Would you just be quiet? And Balaam saw that it pleased the Lord to bless Israel. He did not go to look for more omens. He just set his place, and he does this further blessing. That's recorded in the next one. And then it goes on. The last one I want to get to is chapter 24, verse 17. I see him, but not now. I behold him, but not near. A star shall come out of Jacob, and a scepter shall rise out of Israel, and it shall crush the forehead of Moab. There is a ruler coming out of Israel that is going to crush Moab. That's the exact opposite of what Balak. Now, Balak is still not threatened by this, because Israel is not going to do this to Moab. Not now, not in this generation. Balak has nothing to worry about. But there is a Messiah coming who will rule not only Moab, but all the nations with a rod of iron. So David's Psalm 2 gets its first echo here. A star will come out of Jacob, and a scepter shall rise out of Israel. And then also there's a curse upon Amalek. And Asher is also mentioned. When Asher takes you away to captivity, concerning the Kenites. Verse 22, who is Asher? We haven't met them yet. They haven't arisen on the scene yet, except for a quick mention in Genesis chapter 10. On the table of nations, the empires that will come, Asher is Assyria. Assyria gets its name from Asher. So that's another empire that's going to come and hold sway in this area. First talked about in the book of Numbers. And so we get to chapter 26, and now we're again preparing to enter. So just like we started beforehand, and I think this is why the second numbering, because we've been through all that with the previous generation, and now it's time to get ready to enter the land again. And so we number the people, we get them ready to go. The people are instructed, some more instructions about inheritance now because it's the next generation that's going to go in. The appointment of Joshua because Joshua is going to lead them. Moses is going to see the land, but he's not going to enter it himself. So that generation doesn't enter and Moses doesn't enter. Do you remember why Moses doesn't enter? The second time they get water from the rock. The first time they get the water from the rock, what does God tell Moses to do? With his staff, strike the rock. The second time they're to get water from the rock, and it's interesting, Paul calls it the same rock. Paul says that rock that followed them is Christ. The rock follows them around through the wilderness, ready to dispense water whenever needed. That's kind of Paul's take on it. I think he's just referring to the rock is the same image repeated. And that's why Moses shouldn't be striking the second time. The second time he's only told to speak to the rock, to request, and God will pour forth water from the rock. But he strikes it, and he strikes it twice. And he shouts at the Israelites, you rebels, must we, as in he and Aaron, bring water for you from this rock? Well, they can't. But in striking the rock the second time, that rock that followed them, which is Christ, Paul says in Corinthians, they spoiled the picture. The rock that is struck once continues to provide living water. But he's only struck once. As Paul says, that rock that followed them is Christ. And so that's why Moses, in striking it again, has spoiled the picture. I'll throw that in just as an aside. So they're getting ready to enter the land. Again, Moses is not going to enter, so we have the new leader that's ordained. There's offerings and festivals, and there's the recounting again of the feast, even as was described in the book of Leviticus, chapter 28 and 29. You have again Passover and unleavened bread and first fruits and Pentecost and trumpets, Day of Atonement and tabernacles in chapter 29. And then in chapter 31, the people defeat the Midianites. The Lord spoke to Moses in chapter 31, avenge the people of Israel on the Midianites. What did the Midianites do to them? Well, they go down, and in about chapter or verse 8, they also killed Balaam the son of Beor with the sword. And the people of Israel took captive the women of Midian, their little ones. If we go back to 25, verse 14, chapter 25 and verse 14, in the midst of Israel, what Balaam, and we don't really get this until here at the end of the book of Numbers, Balaam can't curse Israel. He can only bless them because that's all God will let him do. But he still wants a payday. So this is the error of Balaam that Jude describes way at the end of the New Testament. Balaam instructs Balak on how he can get God himself to curse Israel. And that is to entice them to intermarry with the women in the land and be drawn away to their gods. And as they are unfaithful against God with these other gods, then God himself will judge them. And they will put themselves under a curse. And that's what's described in chapter 31. And so they go after the Midianites, who had introduced that idolatry to Israel, and also Balaam, who had instructed them how to do it. In verse 16, you find this, behold, these, on Balaam's advice, caused the people of Israel to act treacherously against the Lord in the incident of Peor. It's a one-off unless we see it in the bigger picture. That Israel in the wilderness is to learn faithfulness to their God and to trust him. Not believing him kept them out of the land, but also going after other gods instead brought God's anger and judgment upon them. What their enemy couldn't do for their harm, they end up doing to themselves in that unfaithfulness. And then you have the tribes settling on the east side. They want to settle, and at first Moses thinks this is rebellion all over again. And I'm still a little uncertain how all that plays out. They see this good land, and we've got big herds, big flocks. This is herd and flock land. Look at the beautiful pasture land. It's no reason that they'll talk later about the fat cows of Bashan, because this is beautiful upper altitude pasture land. It is rich grazing territory. And so they want to settle there. We want to live here. But Moses is afraid they're going to abandon their brothers. That's what it sounds like, that they're just going to stop here. We don't want to go to war anymore. We just want to settle down right here. We don't want to enter the land. And as it turns out, no, we will send our armies in. We will build corrals here for our livestock. We'll shelter our families, and then we will go in with you into the land. We will lead the charge. We will fight with you to receive your inheritance, and let this be God's inheritance for us. And yet, his inheritance for them was supposed to be beyond the Jordan. How do you deal with that? Help me with that. I'm still a little at sea.
They could have gotten a greater blessing by going and leaving that whole land behind them.
By continuing on into the land of Israel. I do wonder, I think the only reason, the only case they can make for this, and I do think why God grants it, as long as they still help their brethren to receive their inheritance as well, is this is part of the land as described to Abraham.
Goes all the way.
All the way to the Euphrates. Yeah, yeah. So I think that's how they could lay claim. This is part of what God gave to Abraham. And so this is our inheritance through Abraham. And if they're approaching it, they don't mention that here. Right? We're kind of left to wonder. But if that's the basis by which they're making the claim, it's actually a turn of faith. And also, if they're believing God's promise all the way back to Abraham, which is what all of this is about. And if they're willing to leave their families and their herds behind, well, they've conquered Og in Bashan, and they've conquered I forget the name of the other king at the moment. Og, and who is the other one? Sihon, yes, the other Sihon and Og, they take them out. So they've initiated they've eliminated the immediate threats in the area, but there are still those pesky Moabites back there, and there are still others further afield, and yet they're willing to leave their families and their herds there and go on with their armies into the land and take on the rest of the Canaanites. So there's got to be some trusting the Lord with who we're leaving behind as well. So.
The blessing and the miracle of the Jordan as well. They didn't cross over the Jordan, correct?
They didn't cross over the Jordan yet.
The parting of the Jordan.
Right, that hasn't happened yet.
Yeah, I know, so that they missed out on things, but
Right, the people as a whole have missed out on that. Yeah, but although their fathers, the warriors, are going to cross over and participate in that. But the people as a whole won't. And there'll be this Jordan boundary between them, actually, that plays out in later episodes. Yeah, there is a division among the people, and it's difficult to keep that side together with the others in the future. But it's an interesting dilemma, because initially you anticipate them going up into the land from the Jordan to the west and all sharing that, and yet 2.5 tribes split off and are satisfied here. And there's a mix on what you do with that. Like I said, it seems to be settling for less, although it is part of Abraham's inheritance. So there's that side of it. Any other comments on the book of Numbers? Yes, Linda.
Maybe a silly question, but when they were wandering the wilderness, did they have a whole bunch of animals with them?
Yes.
Sheep and cattle?
Yes.
Why didn't they have any meat?
Huh.
Huh. Was it all?
That's actually going to, because here at this point, at least at this point they do. We are a people with many herds, and this is good pasture land. Now, did they leave Egypt with all of those, or just a few that was insufficient? That's a good question. I don't have an answer. If anybody else comes up with an answer, bring that back next week. I don't mind at all putting a pin in something and coming back to that. Intriguing answer, or rather intriguing question. How could they not have meat to eat if they had herds and flocks? Oh yeah, those are both clean animals. That's one of the reasons they bring them, is for the sacrifices. They can't do these sacrifices that are required if they don't have them. They've got some animals, but maybe these are God's animals. You're not supposed to eat those. Yeah, and part of that would be not only is...
Maybe they were just whining.
Hmm?
Maybe they were just whining.
Well, there is that. They were just whining. We get, and when they describe a scenario, it is exaggerated. Yes, there is hyperbole. You have brought us out of Egypt to die here. There's nothing to eat. And that is an exaggeration. And yet, our lack of faith can put things in the same terms. We can end up seeing things through not rose-colored glasses, but I guess the alternative would be gray-colored glasses. And we can see everything as dismal and dreary, when it's really not. And sometimes you just need to counsel with a friend who can help you to see another side of it. look at what the Lord is doing here.
The corollary on that is talks about Egypt. We have, if you lived 20 years, they learned about selective repression. The pain we go through, we forget that. And it gives us a peace, and we're happy because of it, that they're looking back to Egypt and they've repressed so much.
Yeah. Oh boy, don't they make Egypt sound good? I mean, you want to take a holiday there. Really? Fish fries by the Nile? With vegetables and relishes, and oh, it sounds so delicious. There's nothing about mud and straw in any of those brochures. So, yeah, we do the same thing, yeah. The grass always looks greener. Yeah. Okay, well, turning over to Deuteronomy. So Numbers in the Hebrew Bible, Numbers was actually called In the Wilderness. That's the name of the book in the Hebrew Bible. Deuteronomy, our name for Deuteronomy comes from the second law, and it comes from the instructions of the king to make his own copy of the law. Almost a mistranslation of the second copy of the law, that the king should make his own copy. Interesting in Deuteronomy, God doesn't intend for them to have a king. He intends to rule directly over his people through the judges, as he did with Moses and Samuel, he will. But they want a king. But he tells them ahead of time, when you have a king, this is what your king needs to do. He needs to make his own copy of the word so that he can refer to it, and that he will know it, that he will take it in, and he will live by it. So that's where we get the name, but it is words. And it comes from, these are the words that Moses spoke. So the Hebrew, in the beginning, Genesis, the Hebrew names for these books, the Jewish Bible, typically come from the opening lines of each of the books. The words of Moses. So Deuteronomy is the words of Moses. It's a good name in the sense that these are the words of Moses to Israel when they're about to receive their inheritance. And these are the words of the covenant. Now here's that. We talked a little about covenants before, and there's a suzerain vassal treaty. Think of it, the sovereign and the vassal states, the reporting states, those that are dependent upon. Later on in Greek culture, you'll have the patron-client relationship on a personal level. This is the same kind of relationship, but on a kingdom level. And so there's an empire or a greater king, and all the lesser powers or city-states, they align themselves with a greater power for protection and for trade, for provision. And they promise loyalty for that. And they are taken in as the greater power's own, but there are stipulations put upon them. It's not a contract in that it's not negotiable. The greater power sets the terms. If you want to be part of my family and my orbit, these are the terms. And it's not, what's the other word I'm looking for when you can back out of a deal? It's non-revocable, thank you. It's non-revocable. That when you embrace this together, when you enter into this suzerain vassal treaty, then you have made an ongoing covenant. In the Old Testament, it talks of cutting a covenant. Do you remember with Abraham? Abraham lines out these animals, and he cuts these animals in half. Half of the body's on this side, half of the carcass on that side. There's half a sheep here, half a sheep there, half a goat there, half a goat there, half a calf, half a calf. And you have all these, it's a gruesome scene, isn't it? And he's chasing the flies away because he's waiting for the other party of the covenant to show up. He's got it ready, but the two parties of the covenant need to walk through this little aisle that's been created, kind of walking the aisle together. And the idea behind that is if any of us break this covenant, so it shall be like these animals to us. It was said to cut a covenant. Okay? So what does God do with the Abrahamic covenant then? Well, as Abraham gets it all laid out, and he's waiting for God to show up, he's chasing the flies away. Finally, God causes Abraham to fall asleep. And while Abraham is over here napping, this flaming torch of the Lord's presence walks through the sacrifices. God accepts the sacrifices. God makes the covenant with no one other than himself. And that's his promise to Abraham. Abraham's not going to contribute anything to it. God is going to do it. And out of that covenant to Abraham, there's a land. And the land promises are going to be played out as described in the book of Deuteronomy. So this Suzeran Vassal treaty, following a pattern, and different people will come up with slightly different, I think the book talked about that somewhat. There's somewhat different approaches to this. Not everybody buys in, but the pattern in Deuteronomy does seem to follow it pretty closely. So if nothing else, God is using familiar terms and a familiar model. I don't think we need to spend the time on, well, did God create this whole historical thing for a greater meaning because he's going to do this, and that then has this heightened meaning to it? I don't think we need to press that. There's fairly clear stipulations of the covenant that we see play out in Israel's history. And Deuteronomy, with this covenant, is the key to the rest of the Old Testament. So there's a preamble, which is very short. The first 5 verses, really. There's a historical prologue. This is how we came to this place. This is how we arrived to the place of being in this covenant together. This is what has happened so far. Look what God has done for you. And there's a couple of those that I wanted to point out. Chapter 4, in the midst of that prologue, chapter 4 in verse 1 and 2. And now, O Israel, listen to the statutes and the rules that I'm teaching you, and do them, that you may live and go in and take possession of the land that the Lord, the God of your fathers, is giving you. You shall not add to the word that I command you, nor take away from it, that you may keep the commandments of the Lord your God that I command you. That's a key in entering into this. That these are the commands for them to possess the land, and not to add to or take away from them. And then look to the end as well in verse 39 and 40. Know therefore today, and lay it to your heart, that the Lord is God in heaven above and on the earth beneath. There is no other. Therefore you shall keep his commandments and his statutes, or statutes and commandments, which I command you today, that it may go well with you and your children after you, and that you may prolong your days in the land that the Lord your God is giving you. Also, in terms of the historical prologue, there's another interesting line in verse 36 of chapter 4. Out of heaven he let you, out of all the peoples of the earth, God let you hear his voice. Paul's going to touch on that in Romans chapter 3. What advantage does Israel have? Well, great in every extent. Unto them were committed the very oracles of God. God spoke through them to the rest of us. And that's what he's saying here. God let you hear his voice. You have been given great privilege. So the historical prologue recounts their exodus, their redemption out of Egypt, and the victories that God gave them along the way. Some of their unfaithfulness and yet God's faithfulness to them. And the conquest of the Transjordan, the Sihon and Og and so on. Og, the king of Bashan in chapter 3. God's faithfulness all the way through. So that the possession of the land. Okay, so then we come to, there's stipulations. There are requirements. And now the stipulations of a sovereign vassal treaty, or here in this covenant, these are not, if you do this, then you will get the land, but if you don't, then the deal is off. The deal's never off. There's just consequences if you don't. That it's kind of like, well, somebody jumps bail. It's not just, well, I guess we're done then. I guess you lose your money and good luck, have a good day. No, they come after you then, right? You didn't keep your part of the deal, but they're not done with you. They just now come after you. And God does come after his people over and over and over again to bring them back to himself and back into this relationship that he's founded with them. So there are stipulations. Those stipulations start with the 10 Commandments. Here we have the 10 Commandments again, except now they're in chapter 5 instead of Leviticus chapter 20. Little side note there, if you wanted to, you can reference back to Exodus 20, same commandments, same order. So Exodus 20 is the first place we see them, and then they're repeated in chapter 5. And then chapter 6, you're to extend this relationship into the next generation. This relationship is not just with you. This is to be extended into your next generation. You're to teach these things to your children. The Lord our God, the Lord is one, and you shall love the Lord with your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your might. And these words that I command you today shall be on your heart, and you shall teach them diligently to your children, and shall talk of them when you sit in the house, and when you walk by the way, when you lie down, and when you rise up. Bind them as a sign on your hand, and they shall be as frontlets between your eyes, and you shall write them on the doorpost of your house and on your gates. And when the Lord your God brings you into the land that he swore to your fathers, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, to give you, with the great and good cities that you did not build, and on it goes. Verse 16, you shall not put the Lord your God to the test. You shall believe him. You shall continue in his word, following in his way. You shall drive out the Canaanites. Part of God's giving this land to Israel is also his bringing of judgment upon the Canaanites. People talk about, in the book of Revelation, what's the whole purpose of the millennial kingdom? And part of the purpose of the millennial kingdom is finishing promises that God has made to Israel that they will live in with a Davidic king on the throne, ruling and reigning in righteousness. But part of it as well is the coming of God's king to the earth and establishing his kingdom is the bringing of judgment upon the rebellious world orders that have preceded him. All 7 of them, and the rest of human history included in that. So the same thing is happening here. That part of God's purpose is bringing judgment on those Canaanite nations for the evils, the terrible evils which they have done. And that God gave another 400 years to them before judgment came. And Israel's entrance into the land, the receiving of the land is delayed from the days of Abraham up until now. And the Canaanites were given more time. And yet now that judgment has finally come to them. And so part of Israel's going in and what we're going to see in terms of the horrible battles that follow in Joshua and the people that are destroyed in the process, part of that is God's judgment on a very wicked and evil and rebellious against the Lord people. Abraham and his descendants are not the only ones to hear from God. The difference is what? What was the difference with Abraham? Abraham believed God, Genesis 15:6, and it was counted to him for righteousness. Yeah. And Abraham, I mean, is it kind of a stretch that Abraham believed God? God is very gracious in the credit, isn't he? God is very gracious in how he describes faith because, Abraham's faith is certainly not perfect at first. It's not that great by chapter 15, but he does believe God. It's weak at times. He fails again. He does the Sarah, my sister, twice. And yet, Abraham believed God. And that's the part that is remembered. And that's the part that is later rehearsed. God is gracious in the faith that he counts toward us. So destroy the Canaanites. That's one of the stipulations. Remember the past and continue in the victory that God has given you. When you cross over the Jordan to dispossess the nations, and you think, those whom you said, who can stand against them? Know therefore that he who goes over before you is a consuming fire. It is the Lord your God. He will destroy them. In verse 3 of chapter 9. So you shall drive them out and make them perish quickly as the Lord promised you, because the Lord goes before you. Can I jump ahead to the book of Samuel? And a young shepherd boy named David comes out to bring cheese sandwiches to his brothers, bread and cheese. And while he's there, he checks up on the battle, and he is stunned at what he sees. Not that there's these two armies at a stalemate in the geography of the land, but that Israel is afraid of the enemy because they're so big. This is so big. Well, golly, where have we heard that before? We heard that in Numbers. We heard that at Kadesh Barnea. And David is not braver than the rest. The goal out of the story of David and Goliath is not to be brave like David is brave, but to believe God like David believes God. If we believe our God, we don't have to defeat Goliath because God will. God will drive our enemies before us. 100 will flee before one, and 10,000 will flee before 100. We've got nothing to fear. The Lord is my light and my salvation. Whom shall I fear? So he's saying, press on into the victory. The first notice that things are going poorly with their inheritance is when you open the book of Judges and it begins to describe how they did not drive out the Canaanites. That's not just a failure to get it done. They have not kept up the covenant. It's not just holding ground. It's not just digging in and settling in. It's continuing to press forward where God would have us to press forward. There's probably some application to be made there as well. Something about the Christian life is not simply about behaving well and not sinning and just waiting and abiding our time till Jesus comes. We will live a good moral life in the midst of the debauchery around us until Jesus comes. But there's more to it than that. We are to be his ambassadors, even in the midst of a hostile environment, trusting him for the results of it. But they're to press on in the victory that God has given them. That's part of the stipulations. Continue in the victory, chapters 8 through 11. There's some particular stipulations as well. For instance, in chapter 12, verse 5. In chapter 12, you're supposed to destroy all their high places where they serve their gods on high mountains. You shall not worship the Lord your God in that way, but, verse 5, you shall seek the place that the Lord your God will choose out of all the tribes to put his name. So there's some specifics, there's general stipulations, and then there's specific as well. Specific. And that includes, there is going to be a central place. They've been carrying the tabernacle around, but it's always wherever the mercy seat is, wherever the tabernacle is. And the Lord chooses to abide among them there. And then they're not just going to worship the Lord wherever they did. What's the danger? If they just set up their altar and offer sacrifices, kind of like Abraham did, as he wandered through the land, and that was okay. He builds an offer, he offers a sacrifice to God. Jacob does the same thing. Sometimes he restores the altar that Abraham had built, and he offers a sacrifice. And that's good. On this place, on that place, and over there as well. But Israel's not to do that. What's the danger of them doing that at this point? As they enter the land of the Canaanites, where they've had all these high places, where they have done their worship to their gods, and Israel comes along and offers sacrifices there, what happens? They will begin to worship the gods of the Canaanites. And so God says, I'm going to give you this land, and I'm going to set a particular place where I will dwell among you. And that is the place you will worship me. And God is reaching back to Abraham here. The city that he chooses is what city? It's Jerusalem. And Jerusalem is on the mountains of Moriah, the same place where Abraham offers his son Isaac. And it's the same place later where God will provide himself a lamb for the sacrifice, as he had told Abraham on those same mountains. In fact, the Israelites firmly believed that the Temple Mount, the mount where the threshing floor was, where Solomon's temple was built, and where the second temple was, and now where the Dome of the Rock sits, that is the very place where Abraham also offered Isaac. Now, the Byzantine Christians said, no. The place where Abraham offered Isaac is actually the place where the Church of the Holy Sepulchre sits in Jerusalem. Just, what is it, half a mile, 3/4 of a mile this way to the west. And on another hill instead, which was outside of the city of Jerusalem in the first century. And so, but regardless of that, and actually traditions on one side or the other, the Byzantine Christians or the Jewish or the Jewish believers as well, said that Abraham was buried either on the Temple Mount, where Abraham later goes, or on the site of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, where Jesus is crucified. That's Abraham's mount, and that's also Adam's burial place. So there's a lot of history in this place. Now, whether Adam's connected with it at all, we don't really know. That's pre-flood, post-flood, the whole geography changed. No maps survived. That part we don't know. But the connection of God choosing a place, but also in making worship different. Making worship not a matter of individual location and place, but about coming to the Lord and meeting with Him in the place of His choosing. And a dedicated place where the nature of that worship has the best chance of being preserved. And it was for a while. But eventually what happens, and we'll get to this when we get to the book of Ezekiel, eventually they have idols of the gods of the nations around them. Canaanite idols are actually installed inside the temple there in Jerusalem, the temple that Solomon built. And that's the point where God says, enough. And it's time to go to Babylon. Speaking of going to Babylon, we do need to get further along here. There's some instructions about prophets, which are important that we should touch on. Chapter 13 and verse 1. If a prophet or dreamer of dreams arises among you and gives you a sign or a wonder, the sign of the wonder that he tells you comes to pass. And if he says, let us go after other gods which you have not known and let us serve them, you shall not listen to the words of that prophet or that dreamer of dreams. For the Lord your God is testing you to know whether you love the Lord your God with all your heart and soul. So that commandment, you love the Lord your God with all your heart and soul, is followed by walking in His ways and not walking after other gods instead of Him. And so the prophet says something, some great sign, and the sign comes true, and he says, well, let's go follow here then. You're not to do it. It's exactly what's going to happen along the way. There will be false prophets, and they will lead Israel astray. But Moses has told them that the prophets are not going to introduce new truth contrary to what God has already given them through Moses. If the prophets tell you something that disagrees with Moses, don't listen to them. That's an important aspect later on. We think about the prophets, and we think about prophets bringing new truth. Well, the prophets do sometimes bring new details of the future, but the prophets are going to be particularly known as enforcers of the covenant. The prophets are describing a future hope, but it's not a hope that Moses didn't know about, and it's not a hope that Abraham didn't also anticipate. The prophets will point to a future hope with a little more detail, and they will point to past redemption. But the prophets talk about justice. The prophets talk about violence. And the prophets bring these various charges against the people. It is always the violations that Israel is living in that are contrary to God's law that has already been revealed. The prophets are not revolutionaries bringing something new. The prophets are conservative traditionalists that are bringing Israel back to their roots. And that's important for understanding how the prophets fit into the Old Testament and how they relate to the book of Deuteronomy. There is, in the Old Testament, there is a core There is a history and there is an exhortation. Okay. In the Old Testament, the core, the foundation, I used core, a better word probably is foundation. The foundation is Torah. First 5 books, Moses. Moses is the foundation. The history is Joshua, Kings, well, Samuel first, Judges, I can't forget Judges. Judges is really critical in there. Kings, Samuel, later 2nd Chronicle will give us another version of it that focuses more on the priesthood. The history. And also some of the history after post-exilic, like Nehemiah, Esther, and so on. The history tells us how did God's people live. So include Ezra, Nehemiah, any of the historical books, the narratives are describing how did God's people live in light of the foundation they were given. The exhortation is the prophets, which is correcting and calling the people to live in light of the foundation that they were given. So that's the Old Testament in a nutshell. Let's do it for the New Testament. In the New Testament, what would the foundation be? The Gospels, exactly. What would the historical narrative, how did God's people live out the gospel truth? The book of Acts. And then the exhortation, comparing to the prophets, correcting and calling people back to live and to be more specific about how to live in light of the foundational truth, would be the letters. There you go. Old Testament, New Testament in about 5 minutes. Oh, sorry? There you go. 5 minutes early. Let me use these last 5 minutes because we haven't even got to the best part yet. So we touched on prophets. There's another prophet. I think I gave the reference 18. The Lord your God will send to you a prophet like unto me, and unto him will you hearken. That's the prophet who's to come that Israel has been looking for, that they asked John the prophet, are you the Christ? He says, no. Are you that prophet? What prophet? The prophet like Moses' prophet. The Lord your God will raise up for you a prophet like unto me, and that prophet's name is Jesus. He is the one better than Moses, according to Hebrews chapter 3. Now, Muslims will tell you that prophet's name is Muhammad. Yeah. Descended from Ishmael, their brethren. We need to jump ahead because I asked you to read from chapter 27. What did you discover as you were reading the blessings and curses from chapter 27? Last part of our Suzeran Vassal Treaty. What did you see there? Well, they are not actually blessed and cursed, but they are on one side and the other as the Levites read out these things. Blessed are you and cursed on you. So it applies to all of them. Maybe they're playing the place of a responsive choir. But yeah, he's not pronouncing a cursing upon them directly here, but reminding that these are the truths. These are the realities of the covenant. Okay, there's this cursed the man who makes the carved, cursed there in chapter 27. And then chapter 28, what do you find there?
Blessings. And then curses.
I'm sorry?
Blessings, then
Oh,
curses.
okay, you have the blessings. The Lord, if you faithfully obey and do his commandments, all these blessings will come upon you. Blessed in the city, blessed in the field, the fruit of your womb, the fruit of the ground, of your cattle and your herds and your flock. The Lord will cause your enemies who rise up against you to be defeated. They will flee, they'll come one way, they will scatter 7 ways. The Lord will command the blessing in your barns and in all that you undertake. You'll be like Joseph, where everything he touched was blessed. That's for you as my people, he says. The peoples of the earth will see that you are called by the name of the Lord. They will be afraid of you. The Lord will make you to abound in prosperity, verse 11. Verse 12, the Lord will open his good treasury, the heavens, to give you rain in your lands in its season, and to bless the work of your hands, and you shall lend and will not borrow. But if you do not obey the voice of the Lord, verse 15, all of these curses shall come upon you. Verse 20, the Lord will send on you curses, confusion, frustration, until you are destroyed and perish quickly. Verse 21, a pestilence will stick to you. The Lord, verse 22, will strike you with wasting diseases. There will be inflammation, fiery heat, and drought, and blight, and mildew. 24, the Lord will make the rain of your land powder. From heaven, dust will come down on you until you are destroyed. Has that happened? Did that happen in Israel's Old Testament history? He tells them at one point, I'm not bringing you to a land like Egypt, a land from like which you have come, where your land will be watered by the Nile. The Jordan doesn't do that. Well, the plain, the Jordan plain to some point would overflow, but the land of Israel as a whole had no river like that except it rained. If it rains, the water comes down and these wadis turn into streams and rivers, and everything gets watered. If it doesn't rain, nothing gets watered. They can't pull up the salt water from the Dead Sea nor the Mediterranean Sea. Galilee won't be big enough to accomplish it. If rain doesn't come, they're in trouble, and God does that. There are times when God withholds rain, and it's because of Deuteronomy 28. It's the first step in broadly getting the nation's attention. You are in trouble, and you need to make a change.
Verse 24 reminds me of what's the word? Habu, the dust storms.
Okay. Okay, yeah. Powder, make the rain of your land to powder. Yeah, it rains dust. Okay, yeah, no, I haven't been in one of those. Lord will cause you to be defeated from your enemies, and you will, instead of them fleeing before you 7 ways, you shall go out one way and flee 7 ways before them. And rather than be honored by the kingdoms, you will be a horror to all the kingdoms. The Lord will strike you like he struck the Egyptians. You shall build a house and not dwell in it, plant a vineyard but not enjoy its fruit. Your ox will be slaughtered before your eyes, but you won't eat it. This isn't for a party. This is because raiders have come and are taking your things away. Your donkey will be seized. Your sheep will be given to your enemy. Your sons and daughters shall be given to another people. The Lord will bring you and your king, whom you set over you, to a nation that neither you nor your fathers have known. Verse 38, you shall carry much seed into the field and shall gather in little, and the locust will consume it. You shall not anoint yourself with oil, for your olives will drop off of the trees. Your sons and daughters, verse 41, will go into captivity. Verse 47, because you did not serve the Lord your God with joyfulness and gladness of heart, because of the abundance of all things, therefore you shall serve your enemies, whom the Lord will send against you, in hunger and thirst, in nakedness and lacking. The Lord will bring a nation whose language you do not understand. They will besiege your towns, and on it goes. He's describing the captivity before it happens. Don't be careless with the words of this covenant. And it's not for them to form the terms. God sets the terms, but he sets before them life and blessing. And he reminds them ahead of time of the consequences. It's connected to the land. This is what we get the term here, the Palestinian covenant, related to the land. And that terminology comes out of the new name that the Romans gave the land that then carried on further into Byzantine and church history. It's got nothing to do with the Philistines, but that land. But Israel does not like you today to use the name Palestine for the land. That was the Romans' name. It was the wrong name. It connects it to the Philistines, and they don't like it. And you sound like a Palestinian sympathizer if you use that land. So if you go on a tour of Israel, do not speak of Palestine. Speak of Israel. And you will get through the airport much easier that way, coming or going. But this Palestinian covenant, this is the means by which Israel is going to enjoy the blessings of the land. If they walk with God in His ways, if they love the Lord their God with all their heart, evidenced by what they do, they are going to enjoy God's blessing and fruitfulness. And if they love others instead, if they are unfaithful to the Lord and give themselves away to others, they will have none of the Lord's blessing. And they will experience these hardships as well. But what's the other thing that you find in these verses? Yes, chapter 30. In verse 1, when all these things have come upon you, the blessing and the curse, as I've said before you, you call them to mind among the nations where the Lord your God has driven you, and you return to the Lord your God and your children, and obey His voice. The Lord your God will restore your fortunes and have compassion on you, and He will gather you again from all the peoples where the Lord your God has scattered you. If your outcasts are scattered in the uttermost parts of heaven, as far away as you can imagine, from there the Lord your God will gather you. From there He will take you, and He will make you prosperous and more numerous than your fathers. The Lord your God will circumcise your heart and the heart of your offspring, so that you will love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul, that you may live. And the Lord God will put all these curses on your foes, and you shall again obey the voice of the Lord and keep His commandments that I command you today. And so He says in verse 15, I've set before you today life and death, life and good, death and evil. If you obey the commandment of the Lord your God that I command you, by loving the Lord, by walking His ways, by keeping His commandments and His statutes, then you shall live and multiply. And the Lord your God will bless you in the land that you are entering to possession. But if your heart turns away and you will not hear, and you are drawn away to worship other gods, I declare to you that you will perish. You will not live long in the land that you are going over to Jordan to enter and possess. And He calls heaven and earth to witness. But even with the reality of the prediction that this is what's going to happen, this is what you're going to do, and when you are there, when you're in Babylon, and you remember, and you return to me in your heart, and your children, I will regather you. I will restore you. I will bring you back. I will circumcise your heart. And there's already, even in Deuteronomy, which we think of the harshness of the law, there's the first glimpse of the new covenant that's to come. That I will circumcise your heart. I will remove your heart of stone, and I will give you a heart of flesh, so that you will walk in my ways. First glimpsed here in chapter 30 and verse 6. So Deuteronomy, that last section from verse 20, or chapter 27 through 30, that's really the core of the covenant that is going to explain the rest of Israel's history. It's going to explain the ups and downs of the judges. First, they'll experience just a little bit of trouble, and their enemies seem to be having the victory instead of them. And then as we get into the kings, it's going to get worse than that. Even to the point that the nation is falling apart and the nation is split in two. And then it's going to get worse from that. And half or most of the nation is going to be carried away into Assyrian captivity. And then it's going to get worse than that. To the point that even the prophets are saying, God, why don't you do something? And God says, I will. And He does. But it's what He said way back in 1406, 1404, somewhere in there, BC, when they're standing on far side of Jordan, just about ready to enter. And God said this would happen, and yet He said he would restore him. And what he said happened, and he does regather them and restore them. And those initial promises of the new covenant are promises that he does fulfill. But we got to put a pin in it there for tonight. Thank you for your patient attention. Tom, would you close us in prayer?
Dear Heavenly Father, thank you for Pastor teaching us tonight, and please please be with the people that weren't here tonight if they have issues at home, and please be with them for that. And please be with us this week that we might witness to folks around in Clark County here that get them to bring to church, and please thank you for everything you do for us, and protect us as we go home tonight. Thank you in Jesus' name, I pray. Amen.
Amen.